Hello, I'm Michael Dennin. I'm here to talk to you about science and religion in the digital age. Specifically, do computers matter? Now, if we're going to think about this, I think the first question you want to ask yourself is, where do science and religion really intersect? They do tend to focus on different topics, they look at different issues, and they have different methodologies. But both of them, at the end of the day, are trying to address questions about what is the fundamental nature of reality. Now, science, it's one of our best tools around for exploring physical reality, that part of reality that we access through our five senses, and the tools we build to enhance those senses. Theology or philosophy or religion in a broader sense is often exploring the question, is there more to reality than just physical reality? And then the two, of course, intersect in that space when you ask interesting questions about how this greater reality may or may not interact with physical reality as we know it. Now, you might think, in the discussion of science and religion and where they intersect, that the most basic question is, does God exist? And it seems the obvious question, and I would argue it's the one that gets the most presence and debate and publicity. However, I think it's also the most problematic question, because it's really, really hard to get people to agree on a definition of God. This definition problem really confuses the matter and often means that you have people making statements about belief in God or belief in the non-existence of God, where the definition of God totally dominates whether you would believe in that God or not. What seems to me in this space, if we define science as looking at physical reality and religion or theology looking at non-physical or the greater reality, one of the most interesting questions is actually that of free will. The question of whether or not we really have a choice in any of our actions versus what I might call an algorithmic decision process. Decisions being made because a set of rules are being followed, even if there may be probability or chance involved in those rules. Now, it's still a little difficult to get a single definition of free will. When you look through the literature and the writers on it, there seems to be a range of what people are willing to call free will. But at its core, it is a much simpler and cleaner idea than the concept of whether or not God exists. And I would argue not only does the digital world start to provide us some insight into this question, but the connection to education provides a really interesting experimental opportunity and place to explore it. So what do I mean by education and the digital in science and religion? I think the question we want to ask ourselves is, what is critical thinking? Critical thinking is one of those skills that in education we highlight as something we want every student to learn. It's one of our top skills. We always talk about critical thinking, complex problem solving, working in teams, learning to learn independently, and good communication skills. But one of the funny things about critical thinking, like free will, it's not always easy to define, and we don't always have one definition for it. But it does evolve at its core some basic decision making. If you're thinking about a problem, you're presumably making decisions. And I think there's an interesting educational question here is, does it involve acts of will? Does it really involve what I might call a true choice? Now, I've used this word a couple of times, and I think it's interesting because decisions are easy to understand. Are you going to do A or are you going to do B? And I can write a program to pick between A and B, and I might even write it just to pick randomly. It does a random number generator, and it either does A or B. That's a decision being made. But I think we would all agree that's not a choice being made. It's pre-programmed into the computer. And for humans, there's that same deep question. We have our brain, and it runs on the laws of physics and chemistry, and it's constantly making obviously instinctual decisions, decisions that we don't have a choice in, where our body's sensory system takes in input, and then the brain computes some reaction, and we react by instinct. If we didn't have this instinct, it would be very hard to imagine how great athletes and musicians often accomplish a lot of what they do, because it comes out of training their brain and body to respond instinctively in an immediate fashion. But on the other hand, we all have this sense that we actually make choices, decisions that aren't controlled simply by the inputs and an automated response, even if that response has a built-in probabilistic element. And this seems to come out in our schoolwork. And it particularly seems to come out when we're asking students to make judgments about things and then we're trying to grade it. And it raises that question often, can a computer really grade critical thinking? It can obviously grade answers that have a clear right and wrong, but will deep learning or artificial intelligence or machine learning ever reach that point where it can really provide rich feedback that an instructor would, as the instructor analyzes the text and makes choices about what to tell the student and what not to tell the student? So critical thinking, if we think about it, is an analysis of a new situation, usually in terms of known concepts, and when our known concepts fail, we have to make the choice to reach out for new concepts and figure out which ones to go after and which ones to learn to create this framework of understanding. And it's really an interesting question, can the computer reach that point? To me, it's a subset of the question of free will, and it provides an opportunity for an experiment. We can work with computers in this space of grading critical thinking in interesting ways to start getting at what free will really is and the role it plays. At its core, I have a hard time imagining an experiment that can truly distinguish what I would call real free will, that real true choice, from algorithmic decisions. Because on the surface, they're both just a decision. So what the experiment would distinguish between is very hard to imagine. It's hard to imagine how you would design it. I have a slightly easier idea thinking about what a critical thinking computer program might look like and how grading critical thinking might work. So it seems to me a good stepping stone to bridge between science, which really at its core, as I said, studies physical reality, but studies things in which you can do reproducible, well-designed experiments, to free will, which I see as an aspect firmly in the space of religion, where you're talking about reality that may involve aspects that aren't physical and may involve having to come up with ways of knowing that don't deal in experiments. So this idea of critical thinking serves, as I said before, as a stepping stone, allowing us to define a real experiment, which is the heart of science, to move closer to a question that I believe is firmly in the realm of theology and religion. So this is a space where digital, in particular digital education, provides this experimental platform to move us forward in what I would argue is one of the most central questions in science and religion. Thank you.